10 years later. Death was often pointless, but given the circumstances, a plummet of 5 floors from balcony to roadside was at the extreme end of the spectrum. Detective Sergeant Solomon Gray was surrounded by white. Powerful lights blazed over the scene, the beams reflecting off the canvas tent sides, erected to shield the body from the elements and preserve any evidence. The jumper was young, a boy on the cusp of manhood. When Gray first caught sight of the corpse, that same shock arced through him like it always did whenever a report came in about a child in trouble or worse, dead. Could it be his Tom? He squatted down to take a closer look. No, this one was older. Relief then, hot on its heels, guilt. Once more he'd avoided facing up to reality. What the hell drove someone with their whole life ahead of them into a swan dive with only one possible outcome? Suicide cases. He hated them. According to an eyewitness, the kid had screamed all the way down, a natural response. Or had he changed his mind when it was too late? Or maybe he was unwilling to jump in the first place. The kid looked remarkably peaceful, given that one side of his body was smashed into the pavement. Gravity and concrete had fashioned him into a chaotic canvas, an abstract that wouldn't look out of place in the recently built art museum less than a mile away. If it wasn't for the Jackson Pollock blood spatter and the vacant staring eyes, Gray could have imagined him asleep. Gray's mind was like an artist's palette, assumptions and suppositions whirling into one colourful mess. The past joining with the present, a reminder of his wife's passing, by her own hand, too. "Are you all right?" asked the attending pathologist, Dr. Ben Clough, who loomed over Gray, casting a long shadow. He peered at Gray through his glasses with unblinking eyes. Clough was a neat, precise man, combed sandy hair, trimmed fingernails, washed clothes, the antithesis of Gray in appearance, identical to Gray in the difficulty he had connecting with people. Clough was competent, bordering on arrogant. Clough had the wiry physique of an athlete, all sinew and muscle. When not working ridiculously long hours, he pounded the streets, loping mile after mile. Most presumed it was an escape from his job. Gray knew Clough just preferred solitude. He could relate to that. "I've seen everything I need to," said Gray. "Haven't we all?" Clough sounded much older than he looked. "I'll call when the post-mortem is scheduled." The pair exchanged brief farewells out of courtesy before Gray gratefully stepped out of the evidence tent. It was overcast and chilly outside. Arlington House, a granite grey high-rise on the Margate seafront, and the deceased's diving board, was perfectly in keeping with the seasonal inclemency and the dingy atmosphere. It looked like a monumental tomb. Gray counted 5 floors and fixed his eyes on the offending balcony. It didn't look that high up. He wiped a hand over his forehead. It came away slick. A gust of wind slapped Gray, reminding him it was December, when autumn was buried and past and winter was tightening its grip. Christmas was on the way, which meant impending merriment, a holiday, and worst of all, the anniversary of Tom's disappearance. A crowd of onlookers had continued to grow while he was talking with the good doctor. They pressed against the cordon, eager to catch a glimpse of the tragedy. Those nearest the tent flap craned their necks, flamingo-like, teetering on tiptoes to see inside. Then the flash of a camera. Gray felt like hunting down the snap and ramming the lens where it wouldn't be found. What was it with people? Why did they take such pleasure in witnessing the misfortune of others? Like rubberneckers on a motorway scoping out the scene of an accident, morbid bastards with their misplaced invincibility, their unwavering belief that such a fate could never happen to them, that their deaths would come quietly, peacefully in old age. Gray knew better. He'd been around long enough to recognize trouble when he saw it. Soon the jostling for a better look would turn to shoving, then a scuffle, a couple of arrests, followed by paperwork he could do without. Hours of police time squandered. The magistrate would no doubt issue little more than a caution to the offenders after a night in the cells, all of it due to the pursuit of momentary gory gratification, a tinderbox of misfortune that just needed a spark. And there it was. Ed Scully, a ruddy-faced freelance newspaper reporter and general ne'er-do-well. Scully was as slick as engine oil, a chameleon who changed his appearance at will to blend with the crowd. Today he was dressed down in jeans and a jacket zipped up to the neck. His hair was shaved back to the skull. If there was bad news, Scully could always be found trailing in its wake, like a seagull following a trawler, scavenging the scraps. There was history between them. The purported journalist had cut his teeth on Gray's misfortunes and continued to nip at him every chance he got. Scully never allowed Gray's wounds to heal, pulling up the past and dragging it through the papers, always revealing some detail he shouldn't have known. Scully oozed through the crowd, seeking prime candidates to interview, those who would deliver the most abhorrent of quotes and so provide the best copy. Scully's roving eyes spotted Gray. The reporter smiled, then winked. Who better to provide a comment than the harried DS? Gray didn't react beyond an internal tightening of the gut and a clench of his right fist. He broke eye contact with the hack before Scully could force his way through the squeeze of bodies. There was work to be done, and Gray didn't trust himself not to screw it up by slamming his fist into Scully's face. Gray turned to the grim-faced police constable supervising the cordon. He nodded at the PC, lifted the tape, and granted him a quick exit. Gray could feel Scully's eyes boring into his spine as he walked on. A minute or two later, within the relative peace of Arlington House, Gray nudged the up arrow a couple of times to summon the lift. His thumb successfully cajoled the mechanism into a lumbering descent of many floors. If the distant racket was anything to go by, he leant his forehead on the metal doors to cool his sweating brow. Eventually the lift arrived and Gray stepped back. The doors slowly parted in a ta-da movement. The lift was empty. He rattled the same thumb at the number he wanted until the doors closed. He read the graffiti as a distraction from the all-pervasive odor of urine and cigarettes. The victim's flat was just around the corner from the lift. Gray wouldn't be surprised if the machinery could be heard day and night. The front door leant drunkenly against the corridor wall. Bent hinges, splintered wood, and some black boot marks said it had been kicked down to gain entrance. Gray wondered whether the act was one of benevolence or opportunism. The corridor was suspiciously empty. Not a good sign. At the entrance, Gray accepted a pair of blue overshoes from a fully kitted-out scenes of crime officer and slipped them on, swayed as he did so, stubbornly refusing to put a hand out to steady himself. One foot, then the other. He removed his coat and replaced it with white overalls. He pulled the hood up over his graying hair. Once he put on a face mask and a pair of latex gloves which obscured nibbled nails and torn cuticles, he was good to go. Inside was a hive of practiced activity. Forensics mingled with CID as they swept the flat for evidence. The party was in the living room, at the end of the corridor which sliced through the flat like an ambulatory highway, off which were doors to a bathroom, a tiny kitchen, and 2 bedrooms. He paused on the threshold for a moment, glanced around. The interior smelled damp. There were lingering brown stains where the ceiling met the wall, a green bloom of mold in the corners. The furniture, what little there was shabby and worn. Light came in through a pair of grimy, full-length glass doors that opened onto a precariously narrow balcony. The only CID presence came in the form of the underfed detective constable, newly shunted over from uniform. The DC was in conversation with a Soko in front of the balcony. Gray interrupted, ignoring the Socko's impotent glare. "Where's D.I. Hampson?" Detective Inspector Yvonne Hampson was Gray's long-suffering boss, the one who had put up with all his quirks because nobody else would. She'd be the senior investigating officer. "In one of the bedrooms, sir." "Point me in the right direction." "T.S. Fowler said I was to find him first when he eventually turned up." "His word, sir, not mine." "Okay, then, get him for me instead." "Sir." Hang on." Gray put a restraining hand on the DC's arm. "Are our people going door to door?" Not yet." "Get them bloody moving, then. Find out if anyone saw or heard anything." "Yes, sir." The DC's eyes spoke volumes. It was a futile gesture. There would be no witnesses, no statements, no helpful off-the-record tips. There never were. And although Gray knew that was the case, due process, even if it had the relative value of a flatulent bowel movement, must be followed. Needled by the continued presence of the Socko, Gray turned and barked, "Haven't you got work to do?" The Socko moved away without comment. Thought he'd never clear off. "He was a she, sir." "Really?" Gray shrugged, unaffected by the faux pas. It's hard to tell who's who in these gimp suits. The DC skedaddled, returning quickly with his man. Thankless mission accomplished, the DC drifted away, exiting the discussion. Detective Sergeant Mike Fowler was medium everything, height, build, and looks, but possessed a sharp brain, a quick mouth, and a tendency to speak bluntly with often intentional side effects. Fowler was one of those guys who was perfectly happy to censure, but hated the tables being turned. "How's it going, Mike?" Of the two men, Gray was senior, a time-served thing, and a state of affairs which rubbed Fowler up the wrong way. "We've only just started. So far it looks like Piccadilly Circus. Socko turned up a load of fingerprints." "How many?" "Dozens, apparently." "They could have had a party, I suppose," said Gray, which elicited a shrug from Fowler. "What else?" "A couple of bedrooms, neither in a particularly pristine state." "Anything major turned up?" "Depends whether you count mistletoe as evidence of the century or not." "Mistletoe?" "Right in the middle of the floor." Fowler pointed at the psychedelic carpet. Gray didn't know what to make of it. "Is that all?" "No." Fowler held up 3 fingers, ticked them off one by one. "Traces of what looks to be cocaine." He indicated a glass-topped table from a bygone era. It was covered in fingerprint dust. "Number 2, a suicide note. Weighed the letter down with a glass so it wouldn't blow away when the balcony door was opened." "Now there's preparation for you. Where is it?" Fowler disappeared briefly to find the evidence. Gray glanced out the balcony window, saw brown sea and grey sky. He wasn't a fan of heights, so this was as close to the balcony as he'd go. Fowler returned with a single sheet of A4 in a clear plastic bag. It would have been photographed in situ before being bagged and sealed. The jagged edge along the top of the sheet led Gray to think it had been torn from a pad. It took Gray a few moments to decipher the shaky scrawl. Fowler was incorrect. There was no justification in the letter, simply a statement of intent, a desire to end it all expressed via a handful of dashed-off words and signed Nick. Probably tears was all Gray could think when he reached the final full stop, which looked like a Rorschach blot. He felt like crying himself. A lab test would confirm or deny Gray's suspicion, not that it mattered. The truth was he could sympathize with the lonely and tired Nick who'd decided the injustices of the world were too much to bear. Gray fully understood the pain but was certain no light at the end of the tunnel, and no afterlife of angels and virgins existed. Who could believe that? He asked himself the question for the millionth time. Why hadn't he ended it all? his subconscious immediately shunted the same old response to the front of his brain. Unanswered questions. Ultimately, he couldn't understand why he or anyone else would just give in, even though people made the choice every day. People he'd known. And now this Nick, among their unfathomable number. And what would happen when he had his answers? No idea. Maybe he'd take a dive too, or step in front of a bus, or maybe drink himself into oblivion. But that was something to consider only when there was clarity, not before. "You should see the bedrooms," said Fowler. Fowler led Gray back along the corridor. He pointed to a door on the right, and Gray poked his head around the jamb. It was dim in the room, thin curtains firmly closed. An air of decay hung here too. "Have Soko been through here?" said Gray. When Fowler nodded, Gray stretched out a hand and flicked on the overhead light. The bulb was one of those weak power savers that took forever to illuminate, and over the course of several minutes brightened to the output of your average pound-shop candle. Gray spent 10 seconds examining the interior twice, once more than was required. The room was at best functional, at worst deprived. A plain rectangular profile, badly painted magnolia walls bereft of decoration, not even any marks from artworks that may have once hung there. A double bed dominated the room, and a low chest of drawers filled the narrow gap between mattress and wall. "Not my idea of home." Gray maintained a tactical silence, reflecting that his own accommodation was almost as Spartan. Instead, he turned his attention to the drawers, slid open the first, then the second. He found dust and condom packets, a few unwrapped, just the foil left. Gray looked at Fowler for comment, but Fowler was quiet for once. Gray switched to the bed. The duvet was askew, rucked, grimy. Maybe the occupant had just got up. With finger and thumb, he drew back the cover. The sheet below was old, worn, and stained. Gray dropped the bedding. "It's a knocking shop?" "Maybe, hard to say. Perhaps the kid was here losing his virginity. He brought some mistletoe along as a bit of a joke." "You tell me." "It's possible, given the fingerprints. Where are the women, though?" "Why does it have to be women?" Gray couldn't be bothered with a discussion on sexism and equal rights. Checked his watch instead. "Is this your number 3? asked Gray. "No, you'll need to talk to the boss about that." "Why?" "Because she said so. I'm just the junior DS around here." Fowler bared his teeth in a failed attempt at a self-deprecating smile. "Ah, speak of the she-devil." D.I. Hampson, tall, elegant, and well-defined, chose that moment to enter the living room. Her gaze landed heavily on Gray with an expression that said, "Finally." A phone rang. Gray's, a bright tone that sounded completely out of place in this decrepit flat. Gray scrabbled in his pocket, pulled out his mobile. Once he'd have felt embarrassed being the center of attention. Now he was accustomed to being stared at, usually in sympathy, sometimes in magnanimity, often in vexation. "DS Gray?" "Sol, it's Jeff," said Detective Chief Inspector Carslake. "Carslake," he mouthed to Hampson in an attempt to stem her apparent anger, holding up a finger to say he'd only be a moment. Hampson threw him an irritated look and crossed her arms. "Where are you?" "The slab." Gray identified the brutalist block by his nickname for the place. "The jumper. What'd you think?" "Not entirely sure. Possibly suicide. We found a note." Carslake sighed. He did that a lot. Like life was a regular disappointment. "Nothing's certain, though. Suicides have been faked before and would be again." "I know. That's why forensics are here. Keep an open mind." "Of course. Has the pathologist been?" "Yes. Clough's having his tete-a-tete with the corpse now." "Okay, good." Gray knew it wasn't. Carslake wasn't a fan of the doctor. The man was too dour, apparently. And Clough didn't drink, a behaviour Karslake treated with a deep suspicion. "I could do with you back here as soon as you can. There's something I'd like to discuss." Although Gray was keen to avoid the inevitable ruckus at the cordon, Hampson would be keen to know what Karslake wanted with him. The perils of the organisational structure. He'd need to play it carefully, as usual. "I'm almost finished here. Half an hour, okay?" "It'll take me that long to walk." "Perfect. There's no need to rush the execution." "Execution? Just my little joke?" It clearly wasn't. "Talk to Hampson first, then find me in my office." Where else? Gray rang off and stuffed the mobile back into a pocket, doubts crowding his mind. What did Karslake want? And why was Hampson even more tense than usual? "Morning, Yvonne." "It's ma'am," said Hampson, agitated. "How many years have I been your boss?" 3, so you should know by now. Hampson bit back a reply. It wasn't as if this was the first time they'd had this discussion. Gray wasn't big on rank, even though Hampson was, which just made him all the more likely to wind her up about it. Most of the time she took it as a joke. Not today. "Door-to-door is underway," said Hampson to Fowler, who was enjoying the spectacle. "Give the PCs a hand." "Hold their hands, more like," said Fowler, though he did as he was told. Once Fowler left, Hampson's next question was as certain as death and taxes. What did Karslake want? It aggravated Hampson that her boss spent significantly more time with her subordinate than with her. Although Hampson was senior in rank, she was junior in years. Gray and Karslake went way back, close friends at the beginning, although a distance had steadily grown between the men over the years, starting with Tom's disappearance. "I've been called back to the station," said Gray. "Karslake told me to speak with you first." "I should bloody well think so. You've got some explaining to do." "What about?" Hampson pulled a bagged mobile from her pocket, an old one, scratched and worn. "Recognize this?" "Fowler's item number 3. "Oh, shit." "It's a Nokia," he said. "Clever. Anything else?" Should there be? He hoped there wasn't, but knew there would. "It was found down the back of a chair in the living room. Nothing in the memory except for 2 numbers. One of them is a dead end, probably a burner that's been discarded by now." "The suspense is killing me, Von. Whose is the other number?" Hampson pressed a button on the kid's mobile. Almost immediately, Gray's phone number began to ring in his pocket. "Yours,"